All right, let's do some NBA faces here. The Minnesota Timberwolves trying to guard Luka Doncic in pick and roll.
The Minnesota Timberwolves when Jaden McDaniels made every possible three in the first half.
The increase in PJ Washington shooting in the last 5 minutes of the fourth quarter. Wait, I should use my left hand because then it looks better since I'm on the right. There we go. Okay, let's get started here. Let's do a podcast. The Dallas Mavericks win their first game one in the Jason Kidd era. They do it despite relatively atrocious three-point shooting, although they did turn it with a couple in the last few minutes of the fourth quarter. Minnesota was very hot from three for most of the game. They went cold a little bit late, but overall, it doesn't show up in the scoreboard. It was close. To me, the Dallas Mavericks, I don't want to say dominated this game, but I thought they controlled it comfortably, and that was just masked by the difference in the three-point shooting.
I agree with you overall, and the three-point shooting is, of course, a huge factor in that. And it ties in for me. Game ones are all about kind of trying to figure out bigger picture things for the rest of a series while acknowledging that circumstances can change. And when we previewed this series on Monday, one of the things I talked about was how Luka Doncic and Anthony Edwards were huge matchup challenges for the other, in part in ways that they had not experienced in their previous matchups, as talented as their opponents were. And how that bore out in game one was that Anthony Edwards, he wasn't as dominant, and he'll make more shots from two than he did in this one. But
maybe we'll talk about that.
We'll talk about that. But Luka is an extremely hard player for the Minnesota Timberwolves to contend with. He's too strong at times for Jaden McDaniels. He's too big, arguably too big, too strong for Anthony Edwards. And we saw throughout the game, the Mavericks were able to generate good looks more consistently than I expected against a still stout, but maybe less perfectly suited Minnesota defense.
Yeah, I think that's right. The number one question that I had was, how are Dallas's stars going to play? Irving, 30 points, 12 of 23. He was dominant, particularly in the first half. Now, his stuff, I think maybe they can clean up a little bit more because a lot of what he was doing was kind of quick hitters in transition. Ant was the main matchup on him, and I felt like an Ant really probably has to guard him the way their starting lineup is set up. But I just didn't think that Ant had any energy today, oddly. And maybe that was kind of and it lasted in the second half in a way that it didn't in game 7 of the Nuggets. But, I thought Kyrie, when he tried to go right at him, did pretty well, and particularly because Kyrie was more active off the ball than he was in the OKC series. And their transition was pretty good compared to the OKC series. Like, Kyrie was able to get a lot of early looks, a lot of quick attacks, just kind of catching the guy who was guarding him leaning the wrong way, quick coming off a screen. So I do think they can kind of tighten up on that a little bit with just kind of better focus on him now that they have dealt with him. It's just a different sort of player than what they've been dealing with before. But I don't think that they can really be that much better against Doncic unless they're just going to take the ball out of his hands.
That's something they're going to have to consider because Luka, he's such a maestro and he's incredibly hard to scheme against. And so if you want to bring an extra player up to touch, you want to bring an extra player to him, he's going to find that pass to the low man. A lot of times that was Derek Lively had some good finishes. It was Gafford really in the third quarter. Gafford, I thought, wasn't the greatest overall in the game, but then he had a big 8 points, 4 to 6 from the field in the third. And I think one of those misses he'd like to have back. But they're generating those looks. Dallas was not generating quarter threes in part because the Wolves are conceding different stuff than the Thunder are, but they were still able to work their way to a 103.3 first shot half court offensive rating, which is completely respectable. And when you consider that the Mavs shot 6 of 25 from three, even if most of those weren't from the corners, that you still expect that to regress to the mean for them. And that 103.3, I want to stay on Dallas's front, but I want to put this context in. That's 20 points per 100 possessions better as a first shot half court offense than Minnesota's ended up being, which was 83.5.
Yeah, that's very interesting to keep an eye on. And with Doncic, you might look at his stat, hey, he's 12 of 26 from the field, and hey, he only had 8 assists. He had 4 turnovers, he had 33 points, but he was -9. And I think, though, if you watch the game, they did not really have answers for him in pick and roll. And what we said in the preview is like, hey, let's see, right? Like they're going to run. They've got a non-shooting big on the floor. They're going to just like, they think McDaniels is a pretty good guy to guard Luka. Like, are they going to try to guard Luka Doncic 2-on-2 in the pick and roll with Gobert and McDaniels? I mean, that is basically, I wouldn't say it is. After watching McDaniels in this game in his specific matchup against Luka, maybe someone like Dort, or I think Andrew Wiggins has always defended Luka pretty well also. Like, I don't think McDaniels did that great of a job on Luka, but pretty close to the best personnel you can imagine to defend Doncic 2-on-2 in the pick and roll. And they tried that in the first half, and basically every pick and roll that Doncic ran, he was just able to get McDaniels on his back or get to a spot in the lane, and he's just so slowed down and so smart. If you send help from the perimeter on those plays, he'll kick it out for a 3. And he's not like most guys are flying towards the rim on these pick and rolls, or the guy from behind can kind of bother them a little bit because, like you put, say, like, a Kelly Oubre on a Jalen Brunson, right? Like he's got a huge wingspan. He can kind of bother him over the top from behind. And then when he can't get all the way to the rim against like a Joel Embiid, it's like, okay, maybe the space that he has to attack in the lane isn't that much. But Doncic is an amazing passer, right? So if the big steps up in any way, he's going to find Lively or Gafford for a dunk. We saw that right at the start of the third quarter. And so but he kind of just meanders his way to these spots. He's so big. His handle is so tight. You're not really going to be able to bother him that much. And then his floater game is amazing. Like he gets to that spot and he's so slowed down. He probably has the second best game from that range outside of Jokic. And so if you only have 2 guys like Gobert, he's one of the best ever at like knowing when to come over or when to stay back with the big and pick and roll. But the window is just so long that he's in the lane meandering to kind of get a shot off that you can't defend it. 2-on-2, he's just too good. So with that being the case, they've got to find something else, I think.
I think they do. And it's also the idea of like kind of the initiator's advantage where Gobert has to respond. Like that is, you can anticipate, you can try to do things as best you can, but Luka being the one at the controls, Gobert can't manipulate him the way that he can manipulate a lot of other guys because Luka he can handle that. And Luka is patient enough that he can wait. And so he forces a commitment and then he exploits that commitment. And Doncic, 7 of 14 on twos away from the basket, only took 2 shots in the restricted area. But overall, Dallas was assaulting the paint, especially the first half. But the overall numbers on it, 21 of 27 at the rim, restricted area, then 10 of 21 overall in the paint, or 10 of 21 from floater range. So if you want to add that together, that is 62 points in the paint against a Minnesota Timberwolves team that has 2 bigs on the floor all the time, even though oftentimes the second one was away from the play. And so even though Dallas's offensive rebound game was not as dominant, they were about 28% per cleaning the glass. They didn't need that in order to be effective on offense, and they were able to generate good looks the first time and just make them the first time.
More on how Doncic was working before we move on. They, as we expected when they ran pick and roll at Towns, that was 2 on the ball. PJ Washington pick and pop. He really failed. I don't think he made a single above the break 3 out of that. And that's just a harder shot when the pass isn't coming from in front of you. You're on the move at least a little bit. Got to get your feet right. It's easier for someone to stunt at you at the top than it is in the corner. So, I think that's something that worked fine. And for the Mavs. And then at the end, as we'll get to, they finally do start putting 2 on the ball with Gobert as well. And so that's going to be a big dance here. Now, Doncic wasn't shooting it particularly well, did hit a huge step back late, actually hit a couple threes in the fourth quarter, but he still is that he looks like he has to just like consciously really get his legs into the shot to get it there and not have it be too flat. So he still is not operating at like 100%. I also thought he really struggled on defense through the first probably 3.5 quarters where his effort level wasn't good. McDaniels got a lot of shots at his expense, and then he really ramped it up at the end, as I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more. And how much of this is it in the Wolves' capability to clean up?
Some of it definitely is. It's something I would be interested in seeing Chris Finch turn to in future games in the series, is that if you're going to put 2 on the ball more regularly, then I think you move Rudy Gobert's assignment. If you're going to put 2 on the ball, then have Gobert play center field. Incidentally, Dallas has done that pretty well in these playoffs. And so in that circumstance, maybe you're putting Gobert on PJ Washington. You're going to concede some quarter threes that way. And I'm guessing Chris Finch is happy that they only gave up 4 in this entire game, but they're giving up shots around the basket. I think that's the trade-off that I would make if you're going to kind of go that route. And it aligns with something that you and I have discussed a lot over the years, which is when you're going to a double, when you're trying to take the ball out of someone's hands, then you actually don't want to use your best defenders because you don't need them to. They're unnecessary to get your best effect, and then you're functionally defending 3-on-4. So you want your 3 best, or at least 3 of your better defenders in the remaining action.
Yeah, and so can they do that? Would be interesting, right? I mean, I think like kind of Brook Lopez, Reggie Evans style from 10 years ago with the Brooklyn Nets, I would actually want to have Karl Anthony Towns pre-switching onto whoever goes up to set the screen. And that's Dallas doesn't do like a ton of crazy movement with Luka. He's very deliberate. So I think you can have reasonable success getting the guy that you want in there, or even just simply, I'm not like Jones Jr. has been pretty good attacking the basket also. I'm not sure if you want Gobert on him because Gobert then also has to defend a shooter, and Jones even can shoot above the break. It just seems like after the Denver series, they really just didn't want Gobert guarding someone who can shoot threes. Even if it was like Christian Braun, they didn't, someone who's standing out there, they just didn't want to have to deal with that. We'll see if they decide to change up. They probably should try to hide it just to do something a little bit different. But yeah, like you said, to me, I would rather just put Karl Anthony Towns in that double team. Or maybe you even go with Karl Anthony Towns double teaming him more kind of even at half court. And this is all when Gobert's on the floor, obviously. When he's not, it totally changes. But you want to fix it so someone else is coming downhill at Rudy Gobert rather than Luka Doncic, who's just so incredible at making the decision and has that floater game. If it's PJ Washington in a 2-on-1 or Jones Jr. in a 2-on-1 at Gobert, Kyrie obviously
Lively or Gafford.
Yeah. So like those guys trying to attack the basket, even in a 2-on-1 against Gobert, I kind of like the odds of that. And they only allowed 25 3-pointers in this game, and not many from Kyrie. Luka took 10 of those. So they really were, I mean, that's been the hallmark of Gobert defenses a lot, right? They can play the pick and roll 2-on-2. But to me, I think I'm trying to make Dallas take more 3-pointers off of spot ups. And I'm also, I like guys like Ant. Hopefully he can play just a better defensive game. This just wasn't a good defensive game for him by the standards that he's shown. Guarding guys like Devin Booker and Durant and Jamal Murray just didn't defend Kyrie well. He got lit up every time Luka was on him as well. He fouled him twice on bad fouls. So I think Ant can play better there. But the way that these guys can fly around too is even better than like an OKC. And I thought OKC's defense was certainly good enough to win in that series. I think they defended Dallas much better than Minnesota did in this first game.
I think preliminarily some appreciation for both what J-Dub did on Kyrie and what Lou Dort did on Luka. Like we're getting it because these are very good. These are very good defenders that are getting some challenges.
But
and
with the caveat that they didn't. I mean, we may have also Luka probably was feeling worse health-wise in a lot of
Sure.
that series than he is now. But yeah, I think that they do deserve some credit there. And also, whenever there was a pick and roll, basically they blitzed either of those guys and tried to fly around behind the play. So that
Yeah.
that obviously made J-Dub and Dort's job a lot easier than, say, McDaniels was in this game. But I thought even at the end, Luka was able to get to his spot and shoot over McDaniels pretty easily once they started double teaming Luka in the pick and roll.
One of my favorite
Yeah.
things that Chris Finch did in the last round was that they would bring in new wrinkles in different games. Part of that was also game 2 not having Gobert, but also Jokic the doubles in game 6 and a few other elements. So that is something I'm hoping and expecting from the Wolves in this series, whether it comes in game 2 or some other point. But why I'm concerned for the Wolves in the series is that there aren't as many things that you can go to. It's a part of why Luka Doncic is one of the best players in the league. Jokic is even better, but Dallas plays kind of a different format of their offense. You're conceding things differently, and it's also that Dallas attacks the weaknesses of Minnesota's defense in a different way than Denver did. And so I worry about how Minnesota is going to defend them the rest of the series. I think they can find different answers. I think some of those answers will be better, but will they be better enough, especially if Minnesota's shooting, which it regressed to the mean even from the first half to the second half. But if Minnesota doesn't have this gigantic 3-point disparity where they make 18 and Dallas makes 6, and it wasn't like Minnesota's looks were significantly better than Dallas's with some exceptions. So I worry that Minnesota can improve, but they might not improve enough.
Yeah, I thought this would be a defensive series, and I thought that the defense against Dallas by Minnesota was not at the level that I expected it to be. A lot of that was just Ant and McDaniels just not being as good individually on the guys that are covering as I expected. There are other things that they certainly could clean up. A lot of that is transition. Kyrie was brilliant in transition in this game. They just got a lot of quick hit aheads. Could have had even more, but Doncic I thought was amazing throwing the ball ahead. He had that one bounce pass was one of the passes of the playoffs that Green ended up missing the dunk on, although it was under some
Great
pressure
play by
Nas
Nas Reed.
Reed. Yeah, but that's where I think Minnesota can be better is just better job getting back on defense. Like Denver, particularly with the fatigue level that they had, just wasn't able to run quite as much, particularly by the end of that series. So that's something I think Minnesota could be a lot better in transition defense against Dallas, particularly in the first half when Minnesota was going really well. That was just how Dallas was staying in it early in it, especially how Kyrie was getting a lot of his points.
Yeah, there
So
was
that they can clean up, yeah. But
they can.
but
Go
then
ahead.
Dallas is going to hit more threes too. So
Sure. And I thought that one of the key points of the game, and this happened in the OKC series as well. Dallas went on an 11-0 run after a strong Wolves start, which was mostly in the Kyrie only minutes. It's a part of why there was that big negative plus minus for Luka Doncic in this one. And Irving, they play with so much more pace. I thought that was something Minnesota had trouble dealing with. And then the most important Kyrie kind of, I don't even think it was technically transition, though spiritually I believe that it was the play at the end of the first half, which is going to linger, I'm sure, for Anthony Edwards. So Edwards hits a huge 3 for a 2-for-1, but then Minnesota has the ball with the shot clock off at the end of the second quarter, and Edwards turns it over, bad pass, and Irving flies down the court and gets not only a 2, but gets an and 1. And so Minnesota goes into basically Minnesota is up 6, and instead they're only up 3 at the half.
yeah, that was a big momentum play. And I did think just largely perhaps my bigger fear. Well, I don't know. I'm trying to think of like, are you more worried about Minnesota's offense or defense after this game? I would say probably defense because I didn't think their offense was going to be that good anyway.
I'm more worried about their offense because again, I have trouble thinking of how they're going to counter some of this stuff, and I think that can be a logical transition into some of the notable elements of Minnesota's offensive game. And so, in the first half, what was really striking was who was taking the shots for the Timberwolves. So you had Jaden McDaniels taking 9 shots from the field in the first half and making 7 of those, including 5 of 6 from 3. And that wasn't nearly as shocking as Kyle Anderson taking 8 shots in 13 minutes and making 5 of those. So Kyle Anderson scores 11 points in the first half. He ends up with 11 points overall. And so that was at times, it was like basically Dallas is more aggressive than most teams at conceding shots to the players. They're like picking players and being like, okay, we'll let you shoot. But Kyle Anderson scoring 11 points on relatively efficient shots, and it was mostly jumpers or whatever you call his
or
limited
the little
jumpers.
Floaters from the foul line. Like
Sure.
he was getting open and scoring there, even running a little bit of pick and roll. I think he had a floater out of that. He had 1 3, didn't he?
He did have 1 3. And so and missed a couple of those. But from Dallas's perspective, you're like, okay, McDaniels career 35% 3-point shooter, 34% this year on 4.5, I believe, per 36. And so if but he's not going to make that volume of them necessarily. He didn't even necessarily do that in the second half. And also, just brief, since we're talking about those two players, one of my favorite things that happened in that first half, Kyle Anderson, it appears they improvised a hammer screen for McDaniels late, like kind of on a play. And that's awesome. And like got McDaniels, that was, I believe, his 5th of his 3-pointers in the first half. And so having a player as smart as Anderson out there who giving him some like space to make a decision, like he can do something there. I think that the Mavs were leaving Anderson too free to do things, particularly with the ball in his hands. But I don't think he's going to burn them the way that he did in this game, because he didn't also in the second half.
Well, and it's a little bit of a conundrum. The whole Reed and Towns thing is like, well, hey, now we got 5 out spacing, but if you play Anderson, you don't really. And then, but they need him on the other end. Like they don't really have another guy who can come in off the bench and guard Luka. Alexander Walker is too small for that. And, McDaniels is going to get in foul trouble probably in some game in this series. And I didn't think he was doing that great of a job either. So, I mean, Anderson might even be their best individual defender on Luka. He just has more experience with him. He knows how to kind of stay off of his body a little bit more and contain him just with his experience. Because, it doesn't matter that slow-mo is slow because Luka is not that quick either, but he still always gets to his spots against someone like McDaniels. So they kind of need him, but then, of course, that hurts their offense a little bit. Doesn't help that Alexander Walker hasn't made a shot since like the first half of the Denver series. That's been a little bit of a problem. And Reed, I thought, came in and did some nice things for them, but that was mostly from the 3-point line. And we can turn now to the overall health of the Wolves offense. You mentioned one unsustainable aspect, getting all this stuff from guys that you don't normally get it from, right? But Towns, 6 of 20, 2 of 9 from 3. Edwards, 6 of 16, 5 of 12 from 3. So those guys were 7 of 23 from 3 and took way more threes combined than twos. And we saw it in the OKC series. We're seeing it now. 49 3-point attempts for Minnesota. That's way more than they want to take. And Towns, he was rushing a few of them. He's getting some decent looks. He'd probably make a few more of them than he did. I would agree with that. And I also thought that Ant was trying very hard to just get other guys involved early to some effect. Ended up with 8 assists. But for him to take only 4 2-point field goals and make only 1 is a massive problem for Minnesota. Like they're at their best when he attacks the basket and can finish there. But the Wolves pretty much always have a non-shooter on the floor. And the Mavs rim protection, as we learned in the last series, is no joke. And then you also, their guys who are going to penetrate don't have the same level of craft that like a Luka or maybe even Kyrie do as a passer, nor is Rudy Gobert as good of an alley-oop finisher as Gafford or Lively, or not to mention finishing on a layup.
And that's exactly Gobert, his touch on floaters isn't great. He can sometimes just fumble the ball, so you don't even get a shot up. And Minnesota's shot chart from the second half, I think, is really telling here. And by the way, the Wolves had a 90 offensive rating overall in the second half. You can compare that to the 132 they had in the first half, albeit 3-point variance being an important part of that overall story. But Minnesota's shot chart from the second half: 8 of 14 in the restricted area. That is the same number of attempts as Dallas, one fewer make. But then 0 for 3 upper paint, 1 for 3 from mid range. And then they did get up 8 corner threes, but they only made 2 of those 8. And then they were 5 of 16 above break threes. And Dallas having consistent rim protection, being able to protect the rim and also keep Minnesota off the offensive glass. They only had 22% offensive rebounds in this contest. Minnesota, there were so many times where even though they got up, a reasonable rate of restricted area shots in the second half, where they got scared off of it, where like Karl Anthony Towns is driving, and instead of getting all the way to the basket for a foul or something else, he's taking a mid-ranger. And some of those shots went in, but you don't necessarily expect them to. And it is harder for Minnesota to scheme out Dallas's bigs than it was for the Thunder. And that's the value of 5-out spacing, is that you can do that. And Minnesota, it's going to take some real work for them. And that work gets exacerbated because they're just not as good of a passing team.
So I think my recipe would be more running pick and roll at the centers. They even had some success doing 4-5 pick and rolls. They ended up deciding they were going to switch that eventually after Towns actually was probably their best passer, finding Gobert. He found him for 2 alley-oop dunks. But I think Ant's got to play better, and he's got to just run pick and roll with Gobert. And maybe Conley can do some of that too. But Dallas is probably not going to put 2 on the ball in most of these pick and roll coverages. So Ant can maybe shoot a 3 off the dribble, or he gets into the lane and he's got to beat these guys 2-on-2, because that's where I'd say certainly Gafford, maybe Lively to a lesser extent. Lively has more mobility and I think just generally better instincts, but Gafford's not an amazing pick and roll defense technician. And you noted how I think things opened up more for OKC when they decided they were going to put Chet in the pick and roll, and also actually force the center to guard Chet too, which is a big part of that. But when they were able to attack that way, it looked a lot better. Now, like, OKC's offense is way better than Minnesota's offense. Like, Minnesota's offense has been good mostly in these playoffs, but an exhausted Denver team, and obviously Phoenix, is a completely different animal to this Dallas team, particularly when it comes to the rim protection that they provide. And Jones Jr. is probably as good or better guarding Ant as any of these guys too. So I don't know how well that's going to work, honestly, but that to me is the best thing, because if you're just trying to drive and kick, beat your man one-on-one, and then one of these centers is there, they're not going to be able to make the read well enough. They're not going to be able to find Gobert. Gobert is not going to catch it. He doesn't get up as high as well. So I think that just involving that center in the action more is, if you just let that guy stay on the back line and challenge you whenever you drive, I mean, the same thing's going to happen to them as happened to OKC.
Another major concern for me about Minnesota's offense is how they're going to fare when only one of their primary creators is out there on the floor, because Dallas can be more aggressive in their schemes. And if you force the ball to like a Nickeil Alexander-Walker or McDaniels specific kind of like aggressive attacks can work when Luka's guarding him, because especially in the first 3 quarters when Luka's a little bit less assertive. But generally speaking, I think Minnesota is going to have trouble creating good shots. You can kind of scheme out some of that stuff. And so the Conley Gobert minutes at the start, which are typically the second and fourth quarters, that'll be a potential pitfall to watch. And I mean, I think that might have been part of the story at the end of the first quarter when Dallas went on that 11-0 run. And so it will be something that Chris Finch and company have to navigate. And I'm not sure what great answers there are. There are a couple of things that they go to. I would also, and I don't think you could do this a lot because Minnesota just didn't run this much this year, I would be interested in running some 4-2 pick and rolls. So using Edwards as the screener just to get Dallas a little bit off suited. Now, maybe they'll just switch those and do some other stuff. But
yeah, well, that's what they did on any Edwards Town stuff. I think they were fine with PJ Washington guarding Ant.
But maybe
the
then
way Ant was going, yeah.
maybe you use that to set up something else. So you do 4-2, you get the switch, and then you run into something else. So you're having PJ navigate some of that stuff. You can just there are some wrinkles they could go to. I don't think you could build a whole offense around those wrinkles, but there are some
Yeah,
things that they can try.
yeah. Or you could go, or maybe you go 2-4 and then basically a 2-4-5 pick and roll. That's something they could look at
Absolutely.
too, and make PJ get over the screen. But I mean, another thing is just that Ant has to play better and be more dynamic. I mean, he just didn't have hardly any drives, and certainly I think they could do more of trying to find him on a closeout the way they did more at the end of the Denver series. But Ant has had two pretty atrocious offensive games, and I still wonder whether that fall he took towards the end of Game 6 might still be with him in some way. But I mean, Reggie Miller was talking about this on the broadcast. We were talking about that he looked pretty exhausted down the end, and that's with a couple of days off. And he looked very passive at the first half of Game 7 as well, and managed to pick up his energy in the second half and get a couple of steals at half court. But I mean, how many 2-point baskets in the half court does Anthony Edwards have in the last 2 games? Like 1? 3? Like
Not
he's just got to
many.
be better than that. Dallas just defended him pretty well, and he's just gonna have to be more aggressive, I think, because they're kind of loading to him some, and that's another reason why I think you just got to have Gobert setting the pick and roll and spacing out more. Certainly have Towns be that next pass, spotting up from 4-point range to make it easier. I also think obviously on defense that Minnesota, maybe you keep Gobert in a drop, but you just try to get more help from guys on the perimeter, leaving Jones Jr. or Washington open above the break. But the problem there is that Luka is he's so deliberate that you can't sort of do the whole okay, dig at him and make him pick up his dribble early. He's just gonna keep going unless you actually get a full body in front of him and leave the guy open. So that's kind of tough.
Mhm.
What else can we
We
talk about, adjustments wise? Anything else stood out to you?
It's not adjustments, but we could take the podcast briefly to the challenge corner, talk about those decisions in this one. Jason Kidd did 2 low upside challenges, both in the third quarter, but both of them were pretty clear overturns. So the first one, the reason it was low upside is that Minnesota, the original call was that the Wolves were going to have the ball with 6 seconds on the shot clock. So it's like you switched the possession, but it wasn't a great possession that you were taking away. And then the second was an out of bounds that pretty clearly hit Anthony Edwards on the foot. And so the argument against using one or both of those challenges is you might need it later. It doesn't appear that Jason Kidd did. So that part of it ended up working out, but it very well could not have. But then the far, far worse challenge came from Chris Finch, where echoes of Pascal Siakam on Tuesday night, Mike Conley clearly pushes Josh Green for a loose ball foul. However, I do really want to thank Chris Finch for that because it allowed Mark Davis to give us a wonderful phrase.
Yeah, the ability to challenge correctly is a subtle but effective skill, which Mark Davis announced. I was so sad. I have my volume turned down when we do the live show, so I completely missed it. But uh, I can't wait to rewatch it later. And that was an atrocious challenge. That was even worse than the Siakam one, because that one there even was a slight a feeling that Jaylen Brown had grabbed his jersey first, and it was also at a key point in the game. Whereas this one, it just Conley wasn't in foul trouble. I guess they thought that Hardaway Jr. flopped, but he was in position to grab the rebound. He would have grabbed the rebound if he didn't get shoved in the back. He's the defensive rebounder too. A lot of times you'll see guys with inside position going for an offensive rebound, just jump and fall forward for a rebound they never could have got anyway. It's very rare you'll see a defensive rebounder do that. So yes, Mike Conley did get called for the first loose ball foul going for an offensive rebound in his career, but it was just an atrocious challenge, I thought. And it wasn't like you're putting 2 points on the board or anything like that either.
No.
By the way, we should have mentioned giving Missoula credit for his goaltend challenge in the first 2 minutes yesterday. That ended up being a huge play. They never even had anything decent to challenge on the rest of the game. So the fact that he did that ended up being a huge deal. Let's see. What else can we point out here? I think they can do a little bit better on Kyrie. We talked about keeping Gobert closer to the basket. I do think Karl Towns posting up. I know he was 6 of 20, but I thought like if they're going to double team him, that's something they should definitely look at. And as you noted, maybe doing a quick pick and roll with him and Ant and getting Jones Jr. on him so he can back down, force someone to come over and help, or even just back into a hook shot or something. But Dallas seems very focused on double teaming off of that, and
Mhm.
I thought that Minnesota really struggled to get two guys on the ball in any circumstance other than that. Dallas was doing a lot of gapping, but they never really went that hard after blitzing. I thought on Edwards. So and also, one other thing I would say about Minnesota is like Conley could play a little bit better. He could make a few more in pick and roll, and they could get more out of pick and rolls between him and Gobert. Potentially, he just didn't shoot it well in this game.
How do you want to handle the end of this one?
Well, yeah, I thought there were a lot of really interesting plays. We can kind of go through it in. Let me get my notes on it in front of me here. We can go through it in like relative order. The Minnesota was like kind of dead, honestly. I mean, that Dallas went on a ridiculous run. They're up 97-89. Minnesota roars back. The only thing they've gotten is a Luka free throw to lead 102-98. And then the PJ Washington three will certainly remember, but Kyrie drives down 4, misses it lively. Another one of those amazing offensive rebounds. Can't go back up. Kicks it out to Luka, and Luka really gets his leg into it. Hits a tough step back. That was a huge shot to get him back within one possession with that 3. So that's also like there are probably like 3 just like random touch fouls called on the perimeter in favor of Minnesota, but none of them led to free throws because Dallas had only committed 1 foul coming into the end of the game in the quarter.
It was an extremely low foul game overall, and then
Yeah,
that
which was fun. I mean, these first 2 games of the conference finals have been great games. Really enjoyed them a lot.
they happened, and it was less surprising to see a Mark Davis crew not overcall things than it was the brothers Guthrie Tyler Ford one on Tuesday. But we'll take it when we could get it, however we could get it. And so Luka makes that 3, and then there was that rapid fire fouling by Kyrie and PJ, and then I thought it was kind of a one of many languid possessions for the Minnesota Timberwolves, where Edwards tried to step back. I thought it was pretty well contested, and then that was the pretty bad PJ Washington turnover, right?
Yeah, well, this was actually great defense by Towns. This is they run the pick and roll with Luka and PJ. Towns blitzes it. PJ gets the ball up top, and Towns manages to like sprint back, get underneath him, and then strip Washington as he tried to drive. And this was the key sequence. So Minnesota is in transition. Towns finds Jaden McDaniels cutting across the lane. It looked like he could just go up on Luka, but I think as I rewatched it, he just felt lively lurking there. And he ended up somehow just like careening into the cameras and having to throw the ball back in bounds. And Luka just stole it. So nice play by Luka, but I think it was really lively lurking that caused him some problems there. And then the Mavs come back in transition. Wolves were notably exhausted. Like they never rotate to PJ in the corner. He hits the biggest shot of the game, putting him up 2. And then there was the offensive goaltending. And that, what did you make of that whole sequence with Karl Towns? 141 left at that point.
It's a really tough call. I mean, you and I were watching it live, and we were genuinely kind of unsure. I think, as the rule exists today, it was enough of the ball was over the cylinder that the goaltend was correct. And I'm not firmly arguing for the FIBA goaltending rule anymore. I used to be a much firmer advocate for it, but it's a bad break for Karl Anthony Towns because I thought, in a weird way, and I don't think this works from a physics perspective. I thought that the ball was off of the rim at one point, then kind of went back in front of it. I think that's just the camera angle. But
Yeah.
if I had to say, I would say it was a goaltend, even reluctantly.
Yep. And they did call it a goaltend on the floor so that they could review it. And that was the right call. I didn't think it was a goaltend live, but of course our camera is very far away. But when you saw the above the cylinder angle, and Towns really got up there, he dunked it like quite a few inches above the cylinder. But the rule is you draw an imaginary cylinder up from the rim, and if any part of the ball, even an inch, which is probably about what it was, intersects the cylinder, it's supposed to be a goaltend. So yeah, that was in fact the correct call. And certainly with it called a goaltend on the floor, there isn't enough evidence to overturn it. So that could have tied it. And then it was another frantic sequence. Yeah.
It was a frantic sequence, but a really nice job by Mike Conley, something the Wolves did not do as good a job of overall in the game. So put 2 on the ball means Derek Lively's going downhill, and Conley's the low man.
And this is with Gobert, by the way. This is I believe that was the first time that they ever blitzed Luka with Gobert. So that was important for what would take place later. But yeah, that releases Lively and Conley makes a great play.
Yeah, and so Conley comes down. Lively has to think about it, and he's trying to get the ball to the corner, or he theoretically could try to finish. Anthony Edwards comes over too, but it's Conley who's there first. And Lively, as he's kind of processing and putting everything together, he travels. And so Dallas is up 2. Minnesota lost 2 points because of Karl-Anthony Towns, and then Dallas doesn't even get a shot up on that possession. So it's Minnesota ball with about a little less than a minute and a half to go, down 2.
Yeah, and so Minnesota gets one of the few times they really get Dallas's defense churning and throw it to McDaniels in the weak side corner. And Kyrie was closing on him from up top. I thought McDaniels could have got the shot off. He tries to throw it back to Conley. Conley gets closed down. He drives, but he had Gobert, and Conley's the guy on this team who can make that pass better than anybody. He had Gobert. Luka was the guy who was the low man, kind of rotate over. He backs off of Conley. Conley throws the alley-oop, and Luka knocks it away. Great play by Luka. And again, he made a number of very important plays defensively. I think he probably just realized that they were lighting him up defensively. Like that was their best offense in the first 3 quarters. And they probably should go after him more in future games. That's probably something we should have talked about more. But in any event, that pass just needed to be higher, though. Like there's no way that Luka should be able to get high enough to knock that pass away before Gobert catches it. And, Gobert has a 9-7 standing reach. Like he can outjump Luka for the ball. It's just the pass was too short. So then I loved the timeout from Kidd. He sprinted all the way into the front court to call it as PJ Washington was dribbling up 1-on-4.
He saw PJ Washington thinking about driving on Karl-Anthony Towns. It's like, okay, let's do something here. And so they end up
also his team was exhausted too. Which he's done a good job
were.
of managing Luka's fatigue in particular with timeouts. He took a good Ueoli before there was with like 4 minutes to go too.
Oh, and while we're talking about pass angles, there was a ridiculously great one from Kyrie Irving to Daniel Gafford early in the game, which felt like it was going to touch the heavens on its way over. And sometimes you need to throw it at that angle to get it over Rudy Gobert.
Yeah, that was right at the start of the third. So they try to get it in Luka's hands, run a pick and roll at Gobert, and Luka notices, remember they got blitzed on the last one, he notices that Gobert is plastered to Derek Lively, and so he just waves Lively away because he knew what was coming. He knew he was going to get blitzed, and he could tell by the way Gobert was acting, and then he just went one-on-one against McDaniels. McDaniels actually kind of knocked it away from him, which was probably the worst thing that could have happened to him because then he was kind of leaning forward, and Luka, he just gets to his spot. Somehow McDaniels, who has great feet, just couldn't get his chest in front of him. And Luka, that's a tough shot for him, but he's added that over the last couple of years, the jump shot going right, which he's usually not as comfortable with. And he trained that one, made it a 2-possession game. Wolves go for the 2-for-1, get a nice play for Towns popping up, but he just misses the 3. And that was pretty much it at that point, other than Luka forcing Minnesota to use their last timeout on an inbound when they were trying to get 2 shots with 17 seconds left, down 4.
And then down 4 at the very end, just to kind of complete the story. Kyrie gets fouled. He makes both of his free throws, so it goes back up to 4. And you're like, oh well, the only way that this can go for Dallas, the only way that this can become a game again is if they do something horrendously wrong. Josh Green ends up fouling Mike Conley, and it's correctly ruled eventually that it's a 3-shot foul. But the way that has to work is you have to make the first two because there's only 1.1 left. You have to make the first two. And then the third one, you gimmick it, you try to, and then get like a putback or something like that. But Conley, who already had missed a technical free throw in this game, misses another free throw. He misses the second. And so at that point, you're basically dead in the water because you have to, in 1 second, get the ball out to the 3-point line and release a shot. They tried and nothing really happened there. So instead, Dallas gets one of the wins in Minnesota. It might not be their only win in Minnesota in these two games. We'll have to see on that. But they're in much better position as the series moves forward.
Yeah, as the internet's missed intentional free throw maven, I must note that my strategy would have been down by 3 after Conley missed the second one with 1.8 left to throw the ball so hard off the front of the rim that it bounces all the way out to the 3-point line and try to just like get the rebound and get a shot off, because obviously there's no way you can get the rebound inside the arc, pass it out, and get a shot off in 1.8. But obviously that would have been fine. You'd have to like throw it over your head into the front of the rim as hard as you can. So pretty unlikely, but that's what I would have done, since this is the type of stuff I like to think about. Take a few questions here.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was going to use that as a transition, but I'll save it.
Sure. Yeah, and then we can talk about the Knicks offseason after that. So let's see here. How much of Dallas getting into the paint more frequently than Minnesota is just down to the extra time off that Dallas had? I wouldn't say that had a ton to do with it. I mean, maybe that helps. And it was only, in the end, 1 day. Luka looks better physically than he did in the OKC series. So I think that's part of it. I think part of it was Minnesota just not being quite buttoned up enough guarding Irving. I thought part of it was Minnesota, just their individual defense not being good enough. I mean, if you're going to say they're tired now, I'd like to see them for the rest of the series. So I don't think the extra day's rest had that much to do with things. Now, maybe you can argue that because Ant has so many offensive and defensive responsibilities that it just is all adding up on him, and he wasn't able to be that good on either end. But I think mostly it's just that Luka in particular is just like imperturbable. And if you're not going to blitz him, like he's just going to get to his spot inside the arc. He's just so good.
We got a question from, who's that from? About whether Josh Green is going to be crucibled. And my answer is no. Oh, from A Rose. No, I don't think he will be, because Dallas needs someone to fill those roles, especially defensively. And Josh Green can do it. And he did make a mistake on the foul late. He missed the dunk and all that, but he has better positional size. You need positional size to defend the Timberwolves. We briefly saw Dante Exum on the floor. I think that Exum can be a part of it, but if the choices are Hardaway, Green, Hardy, and Exum, and you're probably going to need at least 2, probably 3 of those guys to log minutes in the series, Josh Green is one of the answers.
Yeah, I think you're probably right on that, but certainly Minnesota should be more attuned to those guys and their weaknesses on either end when they get on the floor. Guy or G Sutner, probably Guy, since it's a English sounding last name. How much better is this Mavs team than the 2022 team? Well, I guess, Luka back then was probably better just because he wasn't injured. I mean, Kyrie adds an element, I think, beyond Brunson. Although Brunson was very good, but Kyrie is also just a much better off-ball player and also much better on defense. I think this Mavs team is certainly better defensively than that team was, though they did have Kleba playing well. That team, I think, was probably harder to stop due to the way that they could just play more 5-out than this team can. So I would say this team is maybe better, but I think it kind of depends who the opponent is. And then, Bubby, regarding Lively, what other recent rookie or second-year big was this crucible proof, the playoff crucible? Is he really that good, or just optimized circumstances? Certainly optimized circumstances to some degree, because he's got Luka playing next to him and can set him up on offense. He can't do much else. Defense, though, I mean, he's pretty good. I think, maybe if another team was really playing a bunch of spread pick and roll, which they haven't gone up against yet, that like a really great spread pick and roll team.
I mean,
then maybe. OKC was like kind of that, but no, I think he's just really good. Did you have I have an answer though on who the last guy was?
Oh, well, so First of all, I don't think Chet was. I mean, Chet's offensive limitations, but that's the difference between who you're playing with and everything else. And like, I mean, I think Wembanyama would
Yeah.
be, but I want to hear your answer.
Well, yeah. I mean, Chet was very very good too. I mean, he's better
Yeah.
than Lively, but no, the guy that I came to mind for me though was Miles Turner, because
Mm.
basically good bigs just don't get drafted that early. When did Okongwu get drafted? That was 2020. He was actually pretty decent in the 2021 playoffs. That would maybe be the other one.
Didn't Bam was that his? That might have been his
Nah,
third year.
he wasn't really that good until really 2020 was his first like very
Yeah.
good year.
So
So that would have
so
been
that
his
was that
third
was his
year.
third. Yeah.
People in here trolling me about Sabonis third team All NBA. We'll get there, but I think we should probably talk about the New York Knicks offseason first. So
Well,
let's
actually, oh,
begin
so
there. Yeah,
you
no,
want to do that before All NBA?
I think so. But I want to be fully delirious at the end of like 6 straight hours of talking
Okay.
before we discuss it. So yeah,
So yeah, we're gonna do the Knicks. Apologies to those who on the live show who wanted the Thunder. I want to give them the time they deserve, and we just spent almost an hour talking about game one, which it deserved. So we'll get there. And the New York Knicks, they don't have a lot of flexibility, but they do have some real decisions to make. And so to kind of lay out the groundwork for everything for them, the Knicks have, depending on how you see things with Bojan Bogdanovic's contract, they're going to function as an over the cap team no matter what. And they have, depending on Bogdanovic's circumstance, they have roughly 40 million under the tax to both fill out a roster and sign their guys. And the challenge for the Knicks is that, well, so the good news is they have sufficient bird rights on all of the players in question to do it. And James Dolan has paid the tax in the past, though we can't be sure that he will now. You just kind of have to see. It seems like the Sphere is doing pretty well. I'll have to see on all that type of stuff. But the reason why that matters is because I brought up they're about roughly 40 million below the tax, is that OG Anunoby is going to get a lot of money. We don't know exactly how much money, but it's going to be a lot of money, and he is the center of that, even if there isn't as much drama as you and I perceive it on where he is going to sign once he declines his player option.
yeah, and we talked about what the number was going to be for him in a podcast earlier, but I think anywhere from like low 30s to even up to 40 million, especially if there's more pressure from another team coming in, could be the number. And so that's going to put them well into the tax. Then they have the issue with Hartenstein. You want to explain what the issue is trying to re-sign him?
For the second time in his career, Isaiah Hartenstein is facing a challenging retention situation because he was on such a short contract that bird rights are arguably insufficient to bring him back. So the Knicks only have early bird rights on Isaiah Hartenstein, and so that limits them in terms of the amount of the raise they can give him. The good news for the Knicks is that I don't know if any of the other cap space teams are going to prioritize Hartenstein, and they can pay him well more than the mid-level exception. So it's not a circumstance where, like the Clippers, where they just couldn't pay him, or you could think about Denver last year with Bruce Brown. So they can get up to a reasonable wage, but it puts them deeper into the tax, assuming OG Anunoby comes back as we expect. And there is the possibility, and you and I are both big Hartenstein fans, and if another team could, the other thing that somebody could propose, because we assume the Knicks are not going to play ball with the sign and trade, would be, would another team offering a superior role and slightly less money, potentially on a shorter term contract, even though that's burned Hartenstein before, would that be intriguing? So, like, for example, if Memphis declines Luke Kennard's option, they could potentially offer Hartenstein the non-taxpayer mid-level. That is less money than I expect the Knicks to bid. But you're a starting center one place, you're a maybe starting center the other place. You never know what a player is going to prioritize. Nate, I'm not hearing you.
That's because I was muted. Let's say that we're going to assume that Hartenstein gets the most that the Knicks can offer him in year one, which is like 16 million with the early bird rights. And, they could offer him a 4-year deal. It could be a 1+1 with a wink, wink. Certainly there's going to be plenty of competition for his services. We talked about that in that pod about the centers. So I don't think we need to rehash that too much. Certainly it would seem to me that that's like the minimum starting price for him. So you throw that in, you throw in Anunoby potentially getting 35. Let's earmark a combined $50 million for those two guys. And they've got about 40 million below the tax. They also have Precious Achiuwa as a free agent. We'll kind of see what happens to him. Mitchell Robinson is always a health concern. They could bring back Jericho Sims. Potentially he's got a team option. So maybe they would be okay letting Achiuwa go. Maybe they give him the qualifying offer. I don't think he hit the starter criteria this year, though I want to confirm that. But so we'll see. Maybe they keep him around, maybe not. But they're probably about 10 million or so over the tax if they bring back Hartenstein and Anunoby for 50 million each. They do have this non-guarantee on Bojan Bogdanovic for 19 million. He's only $2 million guaranteed. They got to decide on that by June 29th. And Bogdanovic just had surgery.
Could get pushed back.
I would agree with that. But that's, would you be prioritizing keeping Bogdanovic around or bring back Achiuwa if you are feeling a financial crunch?
Bogdanovic, because of the possibility of using him in a trade. And so Achiuwa, you assume he's going to get at least close to properly paid. And they also, maybe if you had a home for like Mitchell Robinson or something like that, I like Precious Achiuwa. I'm a big fan of his. But if you're keeping Hartenstein and you're keeping Mitchell Robinson, we saw Achiuwa's offensive limitations really come to the fore in the Pacers series. And so if he's more of a backup center for a team that isn't playing spacing at the 5, he could be more valuable somewhere else. Like there are a lot of teams that could use Achiuwa's defense. So that could be a circumstance. But if Dolan is willing to pay the bill, there is a lot of value in a guy who can play, who is on a $19 million expiring contract. And so then if you're discussing things, and I don't know if the Knicks are going to do anything, much less something big, but I would pay the money for that kind of flexibility when the other guy involved is probably going to be your third or fourth pick. Probably your fourth pick.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And Bogdanovic, he didn't play that much for Tibbs. Then he got hurt. He's coming off of 2 surgeries, but wrist hopefully won't affect him that much. But obviously this foot thing is not a great thing. He's probably going to ruin his offseason. He's 35. But yeah, if you bring back Achiuwa, he's not going to be on an expiring contract. Or if he is, then he would have to approve any trade. So yeah, having him as the matching salary, not having to move on from other guys you wouldn't want to, like Josh Hart, who's making 18 million, or DiVincenzo, or Mitchell Robinson, or even Julius Randle would be. So this is a manageable tax bill. I would expect Dolan to pay it based on how much money he was willing to pay for unbelievably shitty teams back 15 years ago. And he also has just been printing money the last few years with these teams that have been, kind of around the salary cap.
And on top of that, the Knicks will, depending on Randle and Brunson we should discuss, of their structure after that, locking up some of these guys on longer term contracts right before the cap starts going up 10% every year, that will outpace some of these gains. So their bill, absent the raise that Brunson is going to get, whether that is agreed to this summer or next, that will make it a little bit more tenable in time.
Let's talk about and I guess also maybe they could bring back Burks. I think they could use a little bit of microwave scoring. I don't know if he wants to be back, if he might have better offers elsewhere. They don't want to just throw a bunch of money at him. He could be another guy though, who maybe you bring him back on like a 1-year, $8 million deal.
Human trade exception.
Well, yeah. And make him a walking trade exception. And then you would also get him to waive the thing where he has to approve a trade, the D'Angelo Russell rule, waive his no trade clause in that, or maybe a second year non-guarantee or team option. But I do think Burks will probably have places where he's like likely to play, which I don't think is necessarily the case here.
I think we can discuss the Jalen Brunson thing relatively quickly because the math on it is easy. So the Knicks, what they're allowed to offer is a 4 new years, $156 million extension. That is all under the new CBA, which is more flexible, but is not fully flexible. That is all they can offer Jalen Brunson. What you do is you offer that at whatever structure he wants, and you say, if you take it, great. And then theoretically, Brunson could say yes. He could say no. He could sign a significantly more lucrative deal. We don't know the exact numbers, but something like 5 years, 270, something in that vicinity, starting in 25-26, depending on where that cap ends up. So if Brunson wants to, whether you call it mitigate some risk, get some security by doing that now, more power to you. You make the offer. If he wants it as a 3+1, you say, thank you so much, sign on the dotted line. And you do that. And if he doesn't, then you still think that you have the competitive advantage, not only with the 5th year, but with his connection with the franchise after that. But really, there's some freedom in that being all you can do. And Brunson seemed more amenable going back to the Mavericks. If they had offered the maximum that was allowable then, he probably wouldn't be a Knick right now. So maybe he is willing to take that.
Yeah, that's a possibility. And they also, he could sign that at any point during the season, although I'm sure they'll offer it to him on day one. Randall also is extension eligible, also has a player option that he could decline. If I were the Knicks, and that's another one where there is an extension that you could probably offer him, but that's one I would probably take into the season unless I could get him on a deal that I felt, very comfortable would be tradable, as opposed to just, being something that would be a major problem. Let me ask you this about the Knicks now. There's this feeling that they have been, and this has pretty obviously been the plan, that they're accumulating assets, trying to make a trade for a big player. They acquired that guy in Brunson. Is Brunson like the obvious guy to be a number one on a championship team? I don't know about that. I don't know how much his style leads to like amazing offense, but he was asked to do way more than probably he should. I thought Fred Katz had a really good discussion about this on his Catch and Shoot. I can't believe I had to repeat that terrible pun, but that's what you get when you deal with Fred Katz. But his Catch and Shoot Patreon podcast with Eric Name about, whether Brunson just wants to shoot too much and whether he's easy to play with, guys would want to play with him. And Fred made the point that his usage rate would not have been that high had Randall been around or something like that. But if the Knicks just kind of, hold the fort with this group, bring back everyone for this group that was so good before Randall got hurt briefly, like, is that enough of a team to be a championship contender? Or should they still be in this, let's try to get someone who's a top 15 player in the NBA mode?
I think you big game hunt as long as you can, and you just have to assess the deals as they come. And it does happen that a few of the possibilities could be compelling for the Knicks. Like, I've brought up the Knicks as a possibility if the Wolves pushed by ownership, and hopefully they don't after the success of the conference finals, and potentially more, want to move on from Karl Anthony Towns. Like, you could do they could structure a deal where they could Wolves a ton of money and give them picks, not premium stuff, but they could do different stuff, and they could give something they could give. So they could give Minnesota players who could help them right now. That could involve Julius Randle.
Hold on, I got to interrupt you, Danny. We lost you for a second. Can you just start over with that?
Sure,
a little bit.
I can do
make a note of this time for the YouTube edit. Sorry for those of you who are on here live.
You get to see how this works.
Yeah, go ahead to restart if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think that when you're not definitively in that kind of championship group, and the Knicks could be there, but aren't necessarily, you big game hunt as long as you can. And that is a benefit for them. I don't know that the Knicks offers are phenomenal, though they can offer players who can help right now, depending on the structure of what Leon Rose would be amenable to. I've brought up the possibility of them being a Karl Anthony Towns suitor should the Wolves want to go that direction. Not that I think they should, because they have matching salary, they have some picks, and they can have players that could help the Wolves now. Not that I love the fit of Randall in particular, with this Minnesota group. So I think you talk to them, and the Knicks, they're in a circumstance where they have, like, I've brought up over a lot over the years that I think their assets are a little bit overstated. They have a lot of these like nebulous picks. So for example, this year they have number 24, number 25, number 36, and then they have these like weirdly protected picks from Detroit and Washington that probably aren't going to convey as first round picks anytime soon, if at all. And then they've already
Yeah,
moved
I
on
could see
from some of
Detroit maybe going. I mean, those are each of those have
this.
3, or the Washington pick has 2 years left on it. That's top 10 and 9. That one I would be surprised at this point if it goes, but Detroit is top 13, top 11, top 9. I mean, they're certainly going to try to get out of the bottom 9 over the next 3 years. I don't know if they'll succeed. And then they got that Milwaukee top 4 protected
Yeah.
next year.
So
So, and then
that
they have all their own picks. And
yeah.
by the way, the Dallas pick number 24, that's the final payoff from the Porzingis trade. So they have 1, 2, like, so at the draft, they would be able to trade a total of, in theory, 8 first round picks, but one of them probably wouldn't convey. Another one is pretty questionable.
And none
But
of
none of them are
those,
premium. Yeah.
yeah, none of those we would expect to be a lottery pick. If Detroit conveys, it might be, but we don't know that necessarily for sure. So they can do a volume play. They can't necessarily do a quality play. And so if that gets you in the mix for somebody, whoever that somebody is, you could do it. And making those, the driving the 24 and 25 picks in particular off the lot will change the value. So there is a window here that Leon Rose should use. You see what's out there. Do I think that the Sixers are trading Joel Embiid? No. Do I think that the Wolves are trading Karl Anthony Towns? Probably not. And so you go down the list, you have those calls, you have the resource to make it happen. But I do think that there's an opportunity here for the Knicks to upgrade, and upgrade in a way that makes sense. Like, one of the good things that you have with Brunson and with DiVincenzo and with OG Anunoby is the latitude to add a good player who does a number of different things well. I would love for that player to be able to shoot. Probably need a defensive anchor at center if it's not Hartenstein or something else, who you could still retain in these structures if you wanted to. So I think you aim high, but you don't have to do anything. And if Dolan is willing to pay Bogdanovic to be filler for a trade that is not that isn't lined up, even better, because then you can see where things go during the year. And one of the hallmarks of the NBA in modern vintage is you never know who's going to shake loose. Maybe it's Jimmy Butler, maybe it's somebody else, and I'm sure Tibbs would love that. But you can get into those mixes, whatever they are, even if I think the Knicks offers are relatively weak because they just don't have that sizzle. But other teams will feel differently than I do.
Well, and obviously, if a player wants to be in New York and is nearing the end of his contract, that can very easily thin the market so that the Knicks have enough to move. And, again, their matching salary is not at least bad. So part of the problem with the emergence of Brunson is it just doesn't really make sense to bring in another small guard. Of course, Donovan Mitchell was the one who's always been linked to them. They didn't trade for him. And as it turned out, they ended up with a guy that I think is probably a better player than him, and Brunson certainly was better than him this year and probably more reliable from a health standpoint too. But any of these small guards, like, there are a lot of those guys who might be available. Trae Young, DeJounte Murray, like that. There's talk they might be interested in Murray. I think that would be, we've seen what happens with him at the 2. I don't particularly love that. I wouldn't want them to throw in for that. There certainly are role players that they could get, but probably nobody who's going to start for them. And yeah,
Lauri Markkanen, again, we'll bring him up for almost every team. Like, if they could make that deal
but
happen.
I think if he were truly available, A, I don't think the Knicks have the scratch to get him, and B, I think they would be outbid.
I agree.
I mean, I just, in a vacuum, I don't think Utah would trade him for basically any Knicks package that would be realistic. So here, let me give you a couple of names here that were on my possible trade list. Zach LaVine. You can just say yes or no.
No.
How about, I mean, it's really the star small forwards that then you probably move Randall in the deal and move Anunoby to the 4. So Butler just seems pretty unlikely that would happen. John and I debated him a lot, but Pat Riley trading him to New York, the New York Knicks, don't see that happening. And then like KD would be probably the guy that would make a lot of sense, or Brandon Ingram. Those would be the two guys. But even then, the Suns, they still have Devin Booker. Maybe it makes, if KD really wants out, the Knicks could send back a fair amount of guys who could play plus some draft picks. That might actually be a possibility. And KD has 2 years left on his deal now, so maybe he's got enough leverage to determine where he's going to go.
That would hard cap the Knicks at the second apron, but I think they would be able to navigate that in a way
to get KD. Why?
Because they would have to aggregate salary.
Oh yes, yeah, that would probably be fine though. They can. Yeah. Yeah.
And Ingram, okay. I'm not the biggest fan of Ingram as a fit there because you're going to be playing him with a non-shooting center, and so you run into some things. Now they would have a better defensive foundation than New Orleans did at the 5, but you run into some of those same issues. And Ingram,
he does operate from some of these same areas on the floor as Brunson too.
Exactly where I was going to go. Yeah,
like I don't know that he's really any better than Randall, honestly. And maybe he spaces the floor a little bit better. He's a little bit better. I mean, he's probably better than Randall, but he does provide a few of the same issues. So like he's not the big fish to me. I think you just try to build with this group. I mean, hey, maybe this team is the number 1 seed in the East next year if they're healthy. But they need to bring in some other kind of creator on the perimeter, because it's just too much on Brunson. Like we've seen just how worn out they were by the end. Like they got, that's the one thing that they're kind of missing, and they lost when they moved on from quickly, which was probably the right move. And I'm not sure who that guy is.
You'd love for that player to have a little bit more size so that they could at least play some of their minutes with Brunson. Because if you're spending the resources, you don't want it to just be a straight up backup. So like, for example, I don't love the fit of Malcolm Brogdon there. Like, and somebody who they could have gone after the deadline, and that didn't happen for whatever reason. It didn't happen. But you could kick around a few different complementary guys.
Yeah, I mean, I could see them trading like 25. So could they trade Boyan for Brogdon plus a first?
As a fallback, I could see it. I wouldn't love that.
Actually wouldn't be too bad. He was linked to them too. I think actually that would be a pretty good move for them. Because you make a great point that the guy has to be able to play next to Brunson.
Yeah, and Brogdon can do that better than some, but so can Boyan. But we'll see that. And it's easier for the Knicks to acquire a player who's under contract than it is a free agent. Like, for example, I'd be very intrigued by Malik Monk in New York, but they can't really make that work logistically.
Yeah. I mean, depends what it would cost for Monk. Like, they could probably acquire a player in a sign and trade if they send out enough money back. And they have like those little sweeteners, in terms of like these crappy draft picks to do that. Now, do the King? I guess the problem with Monk is just that the Kings themselves don't have enough bird rights maybe to give him the contract he wants. And if he would take that, then they would just say, okay, we'll stay here then. So that, but yeah, maybe a sign and trade guy. If I don't even want to think really about them losing Hartenstein, it just doesn't feel like it would happen. They would be really screwed if they lost him.
It would be such an own goal because in most circumstances, losing Hartenstein doesn't open up any team building strategies for them. It's not like you lose Hartenstein and then you open up
the full mid-level. Maybe they could probably,
but you're going to get someone worse than Isaiah Hartenstein.
No, you are obviously he is easily the crown jewel. It's not right. But the bigger problem is just that Robinson is so unreliable health-wise too. Like they need someone who's more reliable. All right. Anything else we got to talk about with these guys? I think we're pretty much there. Let's see. Any comments here we should take before we depart? Jeremy Grant. I mean, he wouldn't start for them though. Is probably the issue, right? Like he doesn't want to come there to be a backup.
Well, I think the idea would be that they would include Randall in that deal potentially. Or Randall somewhere else. Like maybe you could even do that.
Yeah, I mean Portland doesn't want Randall in the last year of his deal.
No, but somebody else could. So maybe it's Bojan goes there or Randall goes somewhere a third place and then you do that. There are some scenarios there.
Yeah, okay. All right, I think that's about all we got here.
Well, that's all we have for this, but Yeah.
Just please tell us who's on this All NBA team. I think the voters largely did a good job. I mean, for the
Largely.
important part, they did a good job. Like the two
Yes.
guys who deserve to be on All NBA, whose finances it really affected, like they are going to get paid. These Ant and Halliburton. That's
Yeah.
probably the most important thing.
That's the place to start. I mean, we kind of had an idea of where the top of this was going to go, and honestly, like MVP and all that matters more. But so Anthony Edwards and Kyrie Halliburton, players who signed designated rookie extensions last summer. We don't actually, I think, have definitive word yet that Edwards is all the way to 30%, though it seems like it's going to be that way. That's what we have penciled in. So Anthony Edwards gets on the second team, deservedly so. And so Edwards is and pretty firmly on the second team. And then Tyrese Halliburton, his was a little bit tighter. So he was the second to last guy to make an All NBA team, 75 points, but still he had 75 points, and the first out was Jaylen Brown with 50. So he had some wiggle room to make it in. That for Halliburton justifies the willingness to make himself eligible by what appears to be playing through a hamstring issue. So both those guys getting the 30% that they deserve or close to it. That's very good news. And you always want to see those players get that opportunity. It does vaporize roughly $7 million in flexibility for both the Wolves and Pacers, both of whom will function over the cap, potentially over the tax in Minnesota's case, likely in the tax in Minnesota's case. But then to lay out the full teams, Jokic, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Luka Doncic, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and Jason Tatum. That's the first team. Tatum over Brunson was actually a pretty clear All-NBA distinction. Tatum had 65 first-place votes. Brunson only had 37. Then Edwards, Durant, Kawhi, and Anthony Davis were the other guys. So Anthony Davis, the first player that I did not have an All-NBA team that made one. He was second team. And he was my toughest omission. So that wasn't particularly controversial for me. Then LeBron James. Go ahead.
Yeah. So did we say the full teams then?
No, I haven't done the third yet. So
third team is LeBron, Steph Curry, Tyrese Halliburton, Devin Booker, and Domantas Sabonis. All right. Well, good pod. Just wanted to get that out there, and we could just we'll talk to you tomorrow.
Thankfully, Domantas Sabonis did not make the third team just because some person picked him first team. That would have been bad. But in many ways, him getting those 5 points is not nearly as egregious for me as Sabonis getting 16 second team votes. So those are people who think that not only was Sabonis one of the 15 best players in the league this year, he was one of the 10 best players in the league this year. And then he had 51 third team votes. And so that made him that 104. Like he was really clear of it. So Sabonis had more second team votes than Rudy Gobert had any team votes. He had more second team votes than Paul George. He had the same number of second team votes as Paul George had total, which is completely ridiculous. More than Maxey, and of course like Wembanyama and Bam and all those type of guys. And we hit on Sabonis a lot on this podcast, but it is so much more frustrating to see the yay counting stats, not just yay points, because his points actually aren't ridiculous.
Yeah. No. See, the thing is now it's like it's not just points, because actually his points are like not very good. He's like not a good scorer, really. Like he doesn't like he finishes on the pick and roll and like he'll beat up some guys every now and then in the post and get some offensive rebounds. Like he's not, a guy in most matchups who's like drawing a double team that you're like truly creating advantages for the offense other than the odd, handoff and backdoor pass. I mean, anybody can do those handoffs, but the backdoor passes does add a lot of value. That short roll decision making adds a lot of value, but it's not. This is more to me. This is people being like, "Ooh, maybe he doesn't score a lot, but ooh, look at these rebounds and assists." So like, I'm gonna play like I don't want to say 4-dimensional chess, maybe like 0.5 dimensional chess to be like, oh, I really appreciate ball because I'm voting this guy in on the basis of his rebounds and assists, not just points.
And the Kings were middle of the road in offense this year. And that's not like, oh, they were great in the Sabonis minutes and they were trash in the other times. That is not true this year. They were below
They were
average
worse with him on the floor this year overall.
And I mean, to me, if you were going to pick a king, which of course you need to reward the 9th best team in the Western Conference that had, God, what was their differential? I think they had a negative scoring differential this year, I believe. And like,
I don't think so, but it wasn't amazing.
Oh, it was positive 0.8. So they had the worst positive differential of any team, but they were 19th in differential. And like, I mean, it's not only that like Sabonis and it being positionless in some ways makes this so much worse because then you're like, oh, so you're saying he was better than all of these. It's not even like, oh, you're saying Sabonis was the second best center, which is bad. And like, that's egregious. But saying that he was in the 10 best players in the league this year is completely preposterous.
Well, by any statistical metric that applies to team performance, De'Aaron Fox was easily the most valuable king. Sabonis, I think, was better last year, but a lot of Sabonis's value dissipated as teams kind of caught up to the way that the Kings were playing. Also, when they couldn't hit as much threes, that didn't open things up for him on the interior. But this is one of those ones where it's like, it's just watch the game. Like, if you watch the game, like, how many advantages is he truly creating for his team on the offensive end? And then obviously, I think I disagree with you having him worst team all defense. Like, I think he does execute well enough there, but certainly he's not a plus relative to your average center. And we've talked about how offense is more important than defense for most centers who aren't Nikola Jokic. So, yeah, I mean, that's for him to make it over Paul George or Lillard or Gobert. What did Rudy Gobert do? Oh, he just won Defensive Player of the Year and was on, the team that led the West for almost the entire season. Like, if you want to look at these, like, oh, we're gonna reward winning and go with it, like, and he was like basically had the best defensive rating in the league individually. Like, if that's what you're really trying to reward, it's like some subtle, contribution to winning. Like, how about Rudy Gobert instead? So yeah, not getting, like, I just don't know what it is about Sabonis that, like, why do people like I guess it's just like the triple double, like, and let's not forget the all important double streak. That's what we forgot, Danny. He was in the news because he made 60
I didn't
straight
forget
double doubles. Oh, yeah, okay, all right. Now I take it all back. Now I forgot about that. Triple doubles are meaningless, but double doubles. So yeah, it really just too bad. But the important thing is that Halliburton the voters had every single 14 of the 15 players right as far as I was concerned. The only one I would have had is Paul George over Sabonis. And, I would have gotten Lillard or Fox or Gobert over and, probably 10 other guys at least before I even began to think about Sabonis as well. But, I mean, that's actually, as much as I want to complain about that aspect, like getting 14 of the 15 the same is a lot better than it's been in past years. So I think the positionless aspect did kind of work, and I guess like the only thing. So I guess 4 centers made it. No, because Embiid didn't make it, so 3 ended up making it. Were there any guys who like made it that wouldn't have made it under the old position system? Maybe that's part of why Sabonis did make it, because people were like, fuck this, I'm going to vote for a center. And Embiid's ineligible, so he's the 4th best center.
It is possible that people did that. I think, there's always the question about how Luka counts. So as Luka typically counts as a backcourt player, so then technically there were 7 guards because you have Shea, Luka, Brunson, Edwards, Curry, Halliburton, Booker. So theoretically, one of those would have gotten knocked off. By voting totals, it would have been Devin Booker, but maybe you would have called it differently if some of the voters were restricted in different ways. And then the other way, of course, that the restrictions happened was the games played rule, which I've expressed my vehement opposition to many times. And that probably did make Halliburton his money in a weird way, just because if he had played less and still been eligible, he probably wouldn't have gotten it.
Well, and Donovan Mitchell, might have beaten him out too.
Sure. And maybe Embiid gets a spot.
But yeah, maybe Embiid was just. I mean, there certainly was an argument to me that Embiid was one of the top 15 most valuable players in the league this year, despite the fact he played half the season. particularly since he came back and they went like 6-0 in those games too when he came back
Sure.
at the end. All right, now are we done here?
Yeah, I think we are.
Okay. We'll be back for game 2 of Celtics Pacers. So I'm very, very interested to see what's going to happen in that one. So join us on playback or the YouTube simulcast for that one. Please, if you're listening on YouTube, subscribe and give us a comment or a like or anything else so you can set the notifications to know when we go live. That's always useful as well. So we'll talk to y'all next time. Till then.